We appreciate the presence of everyone. We have a good number present, perhaps even better than we had this morning. We appreciate everyone being with us this evening. As we mentioned this morning, you might be turning in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 32 and put a marker there because we'll be coming time and again to the context of Exodus chapter 32. There is a statement found here in this chapter that says at verse 6, "The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." The only other time that phrase is used is quoted in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and in verse 7, where Paul tells them not to be idolaters, and then he quotes from Exodus 32 and verse 6. It is a reference to what goes on in the context of Exodus chapter 32, where Aaron and the people had made the golden calf, and they worship and honor with their feasting and their singing and their shouting. They're honoring the golden calf. This was all while Moses was on the mount. More about that here in just a moment. So the question is, what does that phrase mean? They sat down to eat and to drink and to rose up to play. What is that talking about? What's it saying? And furthermore, perhaps more important, is could we be doing the same thing? Could it be said concerning us that we sat down to eat and to drink and we rose up to play? And if so, what does that mean we're doing? And that's our purpose in our study tonight, is to analyze that. Let's start with the context and the story. What is the story of Exodus 32? What is the context? What's going on wherein we find this phrase? Well, let's back up just a little bit now to chapter 24, and we'll see in chapter 24 that Moses had gone up on the mountain, Mount Sinai. And we read in Exodus chapter 24 and in verse 13 that Joshua, his assistant, had gone up with him. And so Moses has gone up. Exodus chapter 24 and verse 18 said he'd been gone for 40 days. He went there for a period of 40 days. So much of what we have from Exodus 24 until the end of Exodus 31 is the giving of the law and the writing of these 10 commandments upon the tablets, the 2 tablets of stone that Moses is going to carry back down the mountain, and that he's going to break when he sees what's going on. So Exodus 31 ends on the note that God had given them these tablets of stone. Now that's not all that the law involved. Much of the details of the law is found from Exodus chapter 24 through Exodus chapter 31. Some of the details thereof. So that's the background. That's what's going on. Moses is up on the mountain, the text tells us. Now, while he's gone, Exodus 32 tells us that they built a golden calf while Moses was on the mountain. So let's look at verses 1 to 4. We're not going to read every verse of the chapter, but we're going to scan and get an overview of what is going on and what's the storyline of the chapter, because we're going to build our study around the events of chapter 32. Well, in verses 1 to 4, the people persuaded Aaron to make a God to go before them because Moses had been gone. So notice beginning at verse 1, Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, and the people gathered to Aaron, and they said, "Come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what's become of him." So we need gods to go before us. So beginning at verse 2, Aaron said, "Break off your golden earrings." In other words, take off your earrings. Not necessarily suggesting break, but tear them off or get them off, pull them off. Pull off the earrings that you have and bring me your gold. And so all the people did that according to verse 3. And they brought it to Aaron, and he received the gold, verse 4, from their hand, and he fashioned with an engraving tool and made a molten calf. And then they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." More about the significance of that here in just a moment. Now, at verses 5 and 6, we have Aaron built an altar and proclaimed a feast. So notice now the God has been built, that is, the golden calf has been built. And according to verse 5, Aaron then built an altar, and Aaron proclaimed and made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a fast to the Lord. We'll come a little bit later. Did they make a different God, and it really was a different God, or were they making a golden image to be representative of the God that had brought them out of the land of Egypt? That's a question we'll talk about maybe a little more later. But he proclaimed this fast according to verse 6. And so they arose the next day, and they offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink, and they rose up to play. We're not through with the context. Let's see God's reaction to that. So now we see they've built an idol. They have an altar to it, and there's a fast going on, and not a fast, but a feast going on, celebrating and worshiping this idol. Now here's God's reaction to that, beginning at verse 7. He told Moses to go down, according to verse 7, for the people have corrupted themselves. Get down from the mountain, because those people down there at the foot of the mountain have corrupted themselves by making this idol. God's wrath was stirred to the point that he wanted to destroy them. Now we'll get to that toward the end of our study. But suffice it to say here, beginning at verse 9, he said, indeed they are stiff-necked people. Now let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, that I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation. God was ready to wipe the whole nation out. You remember how Moses pleaded with him, and God then, the text tells us, relented, verse 14, of the harm that he would do to his people. So God's reaction was, they are corrupt. You get down there and deal with that, Moses, and my wrath is stirred. I'm ready to destroy them. Now Moses had a reaction when he came down off the mount. What was his reaction? Well, beginning at verse 15, when he took notice of the singing, beginning at verse 15, when he turned and went down from the mountain with the tablets in his hand, when he heard, verse 17, the noise as the people shouted, Joshua said to Moses, this is the noise of war in the camp. Now, if you can imagine what it sounded like, that the noise sounded like the noise of war. And Moses responded saying, it's not the noise of the shout of victory, nor is it the cry of defeat, but it's the voice of those who sing that I hear. Now notice beginning at verse 19, when he came near to the mountain, when he came near to from the mountain and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger became so hot that he cast the tablets out of his hand and he broke them at the foot of the mountain. His anger is also stirred to the point he breaks the tablets of stone. And so he took notice of the singing and he broke the tablets. Verse 20 says, he took the calf, he ground it up and made powder out of that and put it in the water and made people to drink of that. And then furthermore, I want you to notice at 21 to 24, he has a confrontation with Aaron now. He deals with the sin first, he deals with the idol first, he deals with the idolatry first, and then he turns to one who is a culprit in the matter, and that is Aaron. So now let's begin at verse 21. When he comes to Aaron, he said, what did this people do to you that you brought such great sin upon them? And Aaron responded saying, do not let the anger of my Lord become hot. You know the people, they are set on evil. It's not really me, it's them. We'll say more about that a little bit later. And then he turns and focuses on Moses. And then by the way, I'm going to paraphrase verse 23. By the way, they said, make us a God, because they wondered where you were, Moses. They want to know about this Moses who has delayed his coming down from the mountain. So it's partly your fault, Moses. More about that a little bit later. He has that confrontation with Aaron. Then Moses calls for the slaughter of the rebels. 3,000 were killed. Apparently, these were more of those that were instrumental in the leadership of that, I take, though it's not specifically identified. But you might notice at verse 28 that about 3,000 of the men fell that day. So here was the slaughter of the rebels. And then Moses sought the pardon of the Lord on behalf of the people for the sin that they had committed. Now that's the storyline that's found right here in Exodus chapter 32. Now here's what I'm learning from Exodus chapter 32, and that is that sin has serious consequences. It stirred the anger of God. It had stirred even the anger of Moses. There was the death and the slaughter of 3,000, and thus it destroyed families. So sin is stirring the anger of God. It's destroying lives. It's destroying families. And furthermore, there were bitter consequences of having to consume the water that had the ground up idol that had been ground and put as powder in their water. Now, more about some of those details as we go along. Now, I know the context where this statement is made. Let's go back to verse 6. And you have what is our title for our study, found at verse 6. Right in the middle of this idol being made, and Aaron saying, let's have a feast. And let's celebrate. Let's offer sacrifices. The people sat down to eat and to drink, and they rose up to play. Now, what does that phrase mean, and what does that imply? Well, it is associated with idolatry, first of all. We know that because of the context. An idol had been made, according to verses 1 to 4. They made an idol, the golden calf. And having made the calf, begin now at verse 6, there was feasting that was surrounding idolatry. So at verse 5, he proclaimed and said, tomorrow is a fast to the Lord. The Lord they just made, I take. Now some think that he's saying we're going to feast, we're going to have a feast to the Lord God of heaven, the one true living God that is represented in this idol. That's still idolatry, however you look at it. Or it could be this is now our God because our God has left us and abandoned us, and this is our one true God. Whatever the case, it's idolatry. But the point is, here was feasting that surrounded this golden calf, an idol, and that's what's going on when the text says they sat down to eat and to drink in this feast, and then they rose up to play. More about the word play here in just a second. Now in verses 15 and through 19, when Moses came down with Joshua, they heard some great noise where it sounded like the noise of war. So it's not somebody just murmuring a little bit. What are they saying? Here's a great noise that sounds like the noise of war. And that's what Joshua thought. But Moses said, no, this is singing. And so here is some celebration, some feast, and some singing in honor to this idol. It was something that disturbed Moses. There was dancing associated with that. Now let's go to 1 Corinthians 10 and in verse 7. I'm still trying to argue for the fact that it was associated with idolatry. No one would deny that. I'm just trying to establish that point. Notice at verse 7, when Paul quotes this verse, that he mentions it in the context with idolatry. He's talking to the church at Corinth that we need to not be idolaters as they were idolaters, that is the people of the Old Testament, people under Moses. Don't be idolaters as it is written. They sat down to eat and they rose up to play. So Paul connected it directly to idolatry, somehow honoring an idol. All right, with that in mind, it is altogether possible that it could refer to sexual immorality. Some argue that, and we're going to see that. As was often the case with idolatry. When among the pagans, quite often with idolatry, associated with idolatry, was part of the honoring of the idol was to engage in fornication. And so it was quite a free-for-all with reference to sexual immorality. The NIV translates verse 6, afterward they sat down to eat and to drink, and they got up to indulge in revelry. Now that doesn't imply necessarily there could be revelry that's not sexual immorality, but some have thought that that was trying to imply, the translators thought of the NIV, that they were thinking along the lines of sexual immorality. Well, so were the King James translators, I think, and I'll give you evidence of that here in a second. The New Century Version says they sat down to eat and to drink and they got up and sinned sexually. Well, there's nothing in the text, the Hebrew, that suggests the word sexual should be there, but nonetheless, that's what they thought that referred to. More evidence for that concept would be verse 25. The King James says, let's turn to Exodus chapter 32 and in verse 25, where at verse 25, now when Moses saw the people, I'm reading from the New King James, were unrestrained. The King James uses the word naked there, and that can be translated naked. It just simply means to loose or to untie. And so we'll get to that a little bit later. So we got a lot coming later, so hang on. We're going to deal with that a little bit later, what that word actually means, but it can mean to unloose or untie. And it can have reference to taking off clothes. But it can also have reference to not restraining someone. Now we'll get to that in just a second. So those reasons, some have thought this is talking about sexual immorality connected with idolatry. Now, this is the pulpit. I'm just going to share with you some who think that it refers to sexual immorality. They sat down to eat and they rose up to commit sexual immorality. This is from pulpit commentary. This play, the word they rose up to play, that word for play, was scarcely of a harmless kind. The sensualism of idolatry, of idol worship, consistently led on to sensuality. Well, I won't read all of this because I'm not going to read every one of these quotations, but the pulpit commentary said that most likely that is connected because of this word play here, that it is sometimes used with reference to sexuality, that it probably referred to sexual immorality. Well, let's go a little bit further. Barry, Magnum, and Brown say that the Hebrew word for the word play commonly refers to laughing or to joking or mocking. However, in some contexts, there were sexual connotations like Genesis 26 and Genesis 39. And it is used that way in some passages. So their conclusion was, this is probably having reference to having fun and probably included sexual immorality. Very well may have. So that in this idol worship, they've forgotten about the one true God and have gone so far to commit sexual immorality. And we're going to make a point here and wrap that up in a second. But here's another. Here's Freeman and Chadwick who said that this Hebrew word, again for the word play, in the King James rendering in this verse, is highly suggestive of sexual activity. In the same verse used in Genesis 26:8, it is translated caressing, and in the New International sporting in the King James. Considering the drinking that was taking place and the nakedness, that's assuming that's the right way to translate verse 25, the worship of the calf may have turned into some drunken sex orgy, which is not uncommon among the pagans. Well, they're right about that. That was very common among the pagans. And they may have picked this up, they suggest, from the ways of worshiping while they were slaves in Egypt and even worshiped with them as they did. They may have participated with idol worship while they were in Egypt, perhaps where they picked some of that up. Now, here's one more, Osborne and Hatton, and I won't read all of this one. It simply says, they make the point when they sat down to eat and to drink that this drink probably was intoxicating drink. They assume, though they don't give a great deal of evidence for that. And that being associated with it, because this word can be translated fondling, it probably did have reference, they say, to sexual immorality. They rose up to dance in a shameful, sexually immoral way. Well, now, if that be the case, we're going to talk about another possibility here. If that be the case, you think how far they've gone. The God that brought them out of the land of Egypt, and now, while within 40 days, they've come to the point of taking an idol and committing sexual immorality to honor this idol. That very well may be what took place. It could simply mean that they just did what they wanted. And I think more likely that's the case, which may have included, though, even sexual immorality. That would be true whether sexual immorality is involved or not. So whatever it means to play, does it mean they engaged in sexual immorality or does it mean they just did what they wanted? In either case, they just did what they wanted to do. They sat down to eat and to drink and they rose up to do whatever they wanted to do. They feast in honor of the calf, they sing and they shout, none of which is what God wanted them to do. They were doing what they wanted and not what God wanted them to do. So the phrase, they sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play, very well may simply mean they did whatever they wanted to do. Now let me give you some evidence. This is Douglas Stewart who said concerning this that when they engaged in having fun, and that if any overtone of sexual debauchery is intended here, it is not followed through the rest of the narrative. And I think he's got a point there, that Moses later described the shouting and the singing and the dancing, but not the sort of cultic prostitution the Israelites later indulged in another location, and that was Numbers 25, where they did engage in sexual immorality. Now, they've got a point about that, I think. The NET Bible, first edition, the Biblical Studies Press, said it might fit with wild orgies, but there is no indication of that in this passage, nor does the word mean that. The fact is that they were festive and playing before an idol was sufficient. In other words, they're feasting and celebrating before an idol, doing whatever they wanted to do. So here's our conclusion. Either way, the point's the same. They rejected God and His Word, and they did whatever they wanted to do. You say, well, I think that involves sexual immorality. Okay. Or you say, I don't think it did. Either way, they did whatever they wanted to do. They sat down to eat and to drink, and they rose up to play. Now, more important, is this question. How do such people behave who sit down to eat and to drink and rise up to play? How do they behave? Could that be true of us? Could we be sitting down to eat and to drink and doing whatever we want to do? We're feasting to an idol. No way, we don't have a literal idol. But could we be doing the same thing? Let's look at the context now of Exodus 32. What did they do? Well, first of all, they grew impatient with God. Let's look at verses 1 to 4 of Exodus chapter 32. You remember Moses had been gone for 40 days. Chapter 24, verse 18 says, and this is the same God, that is, the God they grew impatient with. This is the same God that had brought them through the parted sea. You see, they walked through on dry ground. The sea had been parted by the power of God. The same God that brought them through that, they grew impatient with that God. And their attitude was, if God doesn't do what I expect or allow what I want, I need a different God. Let's look at verses 1 and 2, or particularly just verse 1. When Moses delayed from coming from the mountain, the people gathered to Aaron and said, come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. He should have come down by now. Rather than let God make the decision, they make the decision. He should have come down by now. They grow impatient with God. Perhaps we do much of the same thing. See, I want a God that allows me to do what I want. Or maybe I want a God that acts on my schedule, on my timeline. I wanted it done now and I want it done then, and I don't want to be delayed in that. And so I want a different God. Or it may be that I want a God that doesn't make me feel guilty when I engage in some of the things I engage in. I don't like it when I'm made to feel guilty. I don't like when he tells me through his word that this is wrong. And so I want a different God. And so some reject God because of that, and they get a different God. So they grew impatient with God. That's how people behave who sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. But here's something else. How do they behave? They reject God's messenger. Notice verse 1. They didn't refer to him as the servant Moses. They refer to him as this Moses. And then Aaron later tells Moses, that's how they talk about you when you were gone. They said, as for this Moses, we don't know what's become of him. Seemed to be disrespectful toward Moses. But it was really a rejection of God himself. And what I want to suggest, it's no different today. The messenger, when he is rejected, delivering the message of God, when the messenger is rejected who teaches the message of God, it's ultimately a rejection of God himself. Let's turn to Luke chapter 10, if you will. And in verse 16, Jesus told his disciples, in verse 16, that he who hears you hears me. And this was his apostles being sent for. And if they hear the message that I told you to preach, they're really listening to me. But he that rejects you rejects me. And he rejects him that sent me. So he said, you reject the messenger I send, you're actually rejecting me, and you reject me, you're rejecting the Father. That's how people behave who sit down to eat and to drink, and they rise up to play. But what else did they do? Those who sit down to eat and drink and do whatever they want, really is what that phrase means, are people who are easily persuaded. Look at verses 1 to 4. Aaron was easily persuaded to make a god. I don't know how much time lapsed in verses 1 to 4. But as far as the narrative suggests, there doesn't seem to be any pushback on the part of Aaron. Verse 25 tells me there wasn't any pushback on the part of Aaron. And the people come to him and said, make us gods to go before us, because this Moses, we don't know what's become of him. And so he immediately tells them, break off your earrings and bring all the gold to me and I'll make you a god. He was easily persuaded, wasn't he? Not only was he easily persuaded, but the people were easily persuaded to bring their gold. They said, we make us gods. And I don't know how many came and said, make us gods to go before us, but there was perhaps a larger number than that who said, now I'll bring my gold. Aaron is calling for us to bring gold, and he's going to make us a god. And so we start tearing off our gold from our ears, and we take it to him so he can make us a god. They were easily persuaded. There doesn't seem to be any pushback at all. The people were easily persuaded for a feast and a celebration. Beginning at verse 5 and 6. Soon as the idol is built, he said, tomorrow's a feast. We're going to celebrate. We're going to sing and shout and dance. And the people are easily persuaded, and that's what they do immediately. People who sit down to eat and to drink and rise up to play are easily persuaded. And what I want to suggest is that if we're not careful, we can be easily persuaded. We can easily be swayed away from the principles of truth. It might be by the crowd. You remember Moses warned about following a multitude to do evil, the crowd to do evil. It may be because everybody else is going, I can be swayed to go there. Or it might be that I'm swayed by my friends. Let's turn to the book of Proverbs in chapter 12, if you will. A passage we all know quite well, that the righteous should choose his friends carefully. Why do I need to be so careful in choosing my friends? Because the way of the wicked leads them astray. You could easily be swayed. Or it might be that I'm swayed by the teachers of error. Beware lest you fall from your own steadfastness. That is, teachers of error could persuade us, and we could be easily persuaded. Those who sit down to eat and to drink and rise up to play, meaning they do whatever they want, could easily be persuaded. But here's something else in this context. Those who sit down to eat and drink and rise up to play, they focus on what they see now versus the unseen. You see, they could see the golden calf. They could see it and they could touch it, but they couldn't see God. They couldn't look to the skies and say, there he is sitting on his throne. They couldn't look off into the trees and say, there he is sitting, ruling over the universe. They can't see God. They can see the now, but they can't see God. And I want to tell you, we can see the material world around us and all the pleasures that are in it, but faith allows us to see what the naked eye can't see. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 1. This is the very thing they were missing in Exodus chapter 31. Look at Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. The things that we can't see, we have evidence of that, and that's what faith involves. Faith enables us to see what the naked eye can't see. And verse 6 says, he that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's the reward of those that diligently seek him. We walk by faith and not by sight. We don't walk by what we see and what we can touch and what we can feel and what we can taste. We walk by faith. It has been so eloquently defined in Hebrews chapter 11. But let's go back to verse 7 of our context. How do people behave who sit down to eat and to drink and then they rise up to play? They're corrupt. Let's go to verse 7 of our context now. Verse 7 says that God's reaction was immediately to tell Moses, go get down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. That's an interesting word. That word corrupted is translated corrupt, as it is in our text in Genesis chapter 6, talking about the world of the ungodly that God brought the flood upon. They were corrupt, the text says. Same word is translated ruined in Nahum chapter 2 and in verse 2. That same word is translated destroy in Genesis chapter 6. Interesting, that same word translated the people were corrupt, they're going to be destroyed by a flood. So what's the point of that? The point is they behave corruptly to their own ruin and their own destruction. That's what it means. So God says to Moses, you get down to those people because they have corrupted themselves to their ruin and their destruction is what they've done. That's how people behave who sit down to eat and to drink and rise up to play. Now, what I'm learning from that is that there is little or no limit to how far that goes. They are corrupt. They are ruined. They are destroyed. They are corrupting themselves. There is no limit to how far that may go. They now have an idol. They haven't just forgot about God. They've got an idol. They're feasting to this idol and maybe committing sexual immorality in honor to that idol. Let's go to verse 8. How do people behave who sit down to eat and to drink and they rise up to play? They quickly move away. Verse 8. God said, they have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. God didn't say they turned away. He said they turned away quickly from the way. It didn't take years. It took days. It's not surprising when over a period of years someone has drifted and drifted and drifted and drifted, but it took years and now you say they're completely gone. You say, well, I saw that developing. They just got weak over the years. God looks down to the people at the foot of the mountain and said, Moses, they quickly corrupted themselves. They quickly went away from the things that I commanded. It took days. Let's Go to Galatians chapter 1. Sometimes it is a marvel how quickly some move. Now, sometimes people move rather slow. They move a little, they move a little more. But Paul said, I marvel that you're so soon removed from him that called you into the grace unto another gospel, which is not another. In other words, it's another gospel of a different kind. It's not another of the same kind. I'm quoting now from the King James translation of that. You've gone to a different kind of gospel. And he said, I marvel. This is amazing that you so quickly moved in that direction, that far, that you've gone to a different gospel. Sometimes it is a marvel. And I want to suggest to you that if faith is weak or if it's absolutely gone, there's nothing holding us back. You wonder, how did they get there so quick? Well, faith is not there. Faith is that restraint that keeps them from going further. And if the faith is weaker, it's gone. There's nothing restraining them. But here's something else in this context. Look at verse 9. Those who sit down to eat and to drink and rise up to play are stubborn, according to verse 9. There's verse 7 where God said, get down. These people have corrupted themselves. They quickly, verse 8, remove themselves. Now at verse 9, here's what God said. He said, he calls them stiff-necked. Look at verse 9. He said, I've seen this people that indeed it is a stiff-necked people. It just simply means they're stubborn. The idea of stiff-necked gives us a good picture that it means they won't give their neck and they won't yield. It's like a horse or a mule that you may be trying to drive or you're trying to ride and they refuse to bend or bow their neck. You're trying to get them to turn. They won't bow that neck. They stiffen that neck. They won't yield to your direction. And God said, these people are like that. They've stiffened their neck. I'll try to turn them in a direction, and they just stiffen that neck. They won't turn. They won't turn at all. They won't yield at all. Let's go to chapter 33 now. In the same context, I want us to look at verse 3 of chapter 33. As they're preparing to leave Sinai, God said, go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go up in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. See, this was God's view of the people that had come out of Egypt. You're stubborn is what you are. Look at verse 5, same context. Look at verse 5. For the Lord said to Moses, say to the children of Israel, you are a stiff-necked people. Let's go to chapter 34 and verse 9. Chapter 34 and in verse 9, God again said, let my Lord, I pray you, be among you, even though you are a stiff-necked people. Pardon our iniquity. Again and again and again, God said they were stiff-necked. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 15, if you will. And I want to learn a lesson about stubbornness and stiff-necked concepts. 1 Samuel chapter 15, you recall that God had told Saul to go kill Agag. And he spared Agag. And God didn't think much of that. So here's a case where one did pretty much whatever he wanted to do regardless of the direction of God. We too can do the same thing. Here's what God said. Here's what God wants me to do. But I'm going to do whatever I want to do. That's setting down to eat and drink and rising up to play. What God think about that? Look at verse 22 rather. He said, behold, I'm in the middle of the verse. Samuel said, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice and to heed than the fat of rams. See, God isn't interested in sacrifice. What he's interested in is obedience. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. What's he saying? It's no different if I'm stubborn and refuse to obey the will of God. That's not any different from this idolatry we read about in Exodus 32. That's how you behave if you sit down to eat and to drink and you rise up to play. Now let's go a little further in Exodus chapter 32. Here's something else about how they behave. If you sit down to eat and to drink and you rise up to play, do whatever you want to do. We quite often will be the kind of people that bear no responsibility for our own actions. Aaron is a ringleader in the problem. They came to him, said, make us gods. He made them gods. He's the one that proclaimed the fast or feast. Let's have a feast and celebrate. And let's do that tomorrow. But look at verse 22 now. When Moses came to him and talks to him about the problem, he said, do not let the anger of my Lord become hot. You know the people that they are set on evil. What I want you to see is that Aaron blamed the people. It's not really me. It's those people you left me with down here. You know how they are. You know the kind of people. You know how corrupt they are. You know how they think and how they act. They're the ones that had the idea. And then he turns and blames Moses. Look at verse 23. He said, "For they said to me, make us gods to go before us. As for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." You're partly to blame in this, Moses. You were gone so long. If you hadn't done that, this might not have happened. In other words, I don't bear much responsibility here at all. It's the people and it's you. And that's where the problem is. And I want to suggest to you that often we play the same blame game. Something goes wrong in my life, I'm failing as a servant of the Lord, and it's your fault because of what you said to me. It's your fault because you neglected me. It's your fault because you ignored me. It's somebody else's fault because I was not included, rather than taking responsibility for myself. Now, I know how we behave when we sit down to eat and to drink and rise up to play, but let's raise this question from the context. Why did they do this? Why did they do that? Why did they make this idol? Why did they go to Aaron and say, make us gods? And why did he willingly do that? And why did they willingly bring the gold? And why did they make the god? And when Aaron says, let's have a feast and celebrate, then they willingly did that. And they sat down to eat and drink and they rose up to play. Why did they do that? I want to suggest two reasons. The first is the old influences were not rooted out. Their old influences were not rooted out. What I want to suggest to you is they had been in Egypt, the land of the heathens who worshiped idols. They'd been there. In fact, they had seen the Egyptians worship their gods. They were not ignorant of that at all. Let's go to the book of Exodus. We're in chapter 32. Let's back up now a little bit. And let's go to Exodus chapter 12 and in verse 12. Before they come out, I want you to notice in Exodus 12 and in verse 12, God said, I will pass through the land. This is talking about the 10th plague now. He said, I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both on man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt. Everyone knew about the gods of Egypt, the plural gods, the many gods they had. They didn't have one true living God. They had gods. God said, I'm going to execute wrath on the people and on the land and on the gods of the Egyptians. You couldn't live in Egypt and not be familiar with the gods of the Egyptians. Let's turn over to Exodus chapter 18 and verse 11. Exodus 18 and verse 11, I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which you behaved proudly, he was above them. Now these gods that the Egyptians had, God was above these gods. I'm just simply suggesting to you, the Egyptians had their gods, the Israelites were quite familiar with their gods. Now, they had to be influenced by that. I might share with you a couple of quotations here, that the old influence of Egypt was not abandoned. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown make this point. It's a remarkable circumstance, strongly confirmatory to the view that they had not renounced the worship of Jehovah. I'm not sure that's the case. But let's follow what they say. But in accordance with Egyptian notion, they had formed an image with which they had been familiar to be the visible symbol of the divine presence. But there seems to have been much of the revelry that marked the feast of the heathen. What they're saying is, they didn't root out, when they left Egypt, they didn't root out all the problems that they had in Egypt. They didn't root out the idolatry that had influenced them in Egypt. And they took some of that concept with them. Cal and David said they'd fallen back to the heathen customs of Egypt. Moses is gone. We don't know what happened to him. When's he coming back? We're not sure. Let's go back with what we are familiar, and we are familiar with those gods of Egypt. Let's make us one like that. They didn't root out the things they found in Egypt. I want to tell you, when we come out of our Egypt, we must root out all the influences. It might be that our Egypt is the world of sin. We might have come out of a world of sin, and all the corruption in the world of sin, we've got to root that out, or it's going to spring up again somewhere down the line. Even after we've come out into our wilderness or into on our way to our promised land. It might be that our Egypt is denominationalism. And if we don't root out the errors of denominationalism, that may spring up again. We might have bought into some of the corruption of Calvinism when we were in denominationalism. And if we don't root that out, it may spring up again. And so our Egypt may spring up again and haunt us. Our Egypt might be the errors of institutionalism. And we come from that, but if we don't root out that concept of not following the authority of God and root all of that out, it may spring up again to haunt us again. Just like it did here in Exodus chapter 32. So why did they do that? Well, the old influences had not been rooted out completely, but there's a second reason why, and that is they were unrestrained. Look at verse 25 of our context. Look at verse 25. The text says, now Moses saw the people were unrestrained. New King James, if you're reading it, will say the word naked there. It's not a bad translation. It's just whether that's the point. It says they were unrestrained. And then in parentheses, the text says, for Aaron had not restrained them to their shame among their enemies. Why did they do what they did? Because they were unrestrained. Now that same word is translated in 2 Chronicles 28 and verse 19 to encourage moral decline. They were unrestrained. Same concept as encouraging moral decline. That's interesting. Same word is translated in Proverbs 29:18 to cast off restraint. They cast off restraint. Remember I said the word means to untie, to loose. We'll get to that in a second. Same word is translated in Proverbs 1, Proverbs 8, Proverbs 13 to disdain, as in disdaining instruction and disdaining counsel or disdaining God's word. You have a disdain for that. So you dismiss it, you turn it loose, you let it go. Same word. They were unrestrained. Brown, Driver, and Brick says that word simply means to let go or to let alone. It means to untie. So it can mean to be naked because you untie and take off the clothes. Okay, it can mean that. But it can also mean that you cast off restraint. That's what you're casting off. Or it may have to do with disdain, or it may have reference to moral decline. It just simply means they were unrestrained. Let's go back to verse 25. This is an important point. There was something that Aaron could have done about that. That's interesting to me. Whatever this is, they were unrestrained because Aaron did not restrain them. There was something that Aaron could have done about that he didn't do. Like what? When they come and said, make us gods, he could have rebuked them for that. When they said, we need someone to go before us because we don't know where this Moses is, he could have told them he's staying there by God's direction. He could have restrained them. When they say we want to make gold and take our gold and make gods, he could have said, no, we're not going to do that. But he didn't do that. There was something he could have done. I want to suggest our lack of restraint could be maybe nothing in the preaching is restraining us. See, maybe the reason people dress the way they do, or maybe the reason that people drink, the reason they're going to the dance, or they're doing whatever else it may be that's part of worldliness, is there's not any preaching against that. And so maybe we sit down to eat and drink and we rise up to play because maybe the elders are not doing their work of restraining. Trying to tell people, no, we're not going to do that. You can't do that. That's wrong. We're watching for your soul. Or it may be there's nothing in parental training that restrains. Maybe we engage in worldliness because mom and dad don't see anything wrong with it. Maybe we engage in some sin because mom and dad didn't discourage it. Notice again, verse 25, that Aaron did not restrain them. Now, one more point and the lesson is yours. I want to just quickly make the point that this stirred the wrath of God. When people sat down to eat and to drink and they rose up to play, it stirred the wrath of God. Let's go back to verse 9. Beginning at verse 9, I want you to see this was more than God being a little displeased. In fact, God became so angry that he was ready to wipe out the whole nation. And Moses pled with him, what is going now the reputation be when the nations around and the Egyptians hear that you brought them out to destroy them? So God relented of what he thought he would do. Now Moses led with God's instruction in the killing of 3,000. Suggests God's not just a little displeased, God is greatly displeased at what they did. And I want us to conclude by noticing that living as you wish and doing what you want will stir the wrath of God. Let's notice 2 or 3 passages, and the lesson will be yours. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 7. Whenever you live like you want to live, you just do whatever you want to do, what will happen is you'll stir the wrath of God. Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 6. He mentioned at verse 5 about fornication, uncleanness, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry, various sins. Then after that, he mentions some other sins like wrath and anger and malice and blasphemy and filthy language. But notice what verse 6 says, because of these things, the wrath of God is coming on the sons of disobedience. God's wrath is stirred when we do whatever we want. Notice in Romans chapter 1, the Gentile world, the pagan world. Verse 18 said, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And then he gives a whole host of sins that are involved. And one more verse I want to mention along that line is Romans chapter 12 and in verse 19. Neither give place to wrath, because God said, vengeance is mine. What's interesting about that, God said, I sit in the seat of executing wrath. My wrath will be stirred and can be stirred, and I'll execute that wrath. Don't you take that place. I'll do that. I will execute wrath. And God will execute wrath against those who live as they wish. The people sat down to eat and to drink, and they rose up to play. What does that mean? It means they did pretty much whatever they wanted. They did pretty much whatever they wanted. We see what the context means, what the context says, what the phrase means, and how people behave, and why they did that, and the fact that that stirs the wrath of God. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and while we sing?